I'm doing my life in real time. Oh, there's so many of these stories that I see.
Okay, we're back on. $64,000 challenge.
Not the most glorious chapter in my life, I suppose. When I first was approached by doing the pilot, now $64,000 challenge, I have to set this, was preceded by $64,000 question, which had started the year before and was indubitably the breakout hit of television. And it was a monstrous, wonderfully attended show. It was on every Tuesday night at 10 o'clock on CBS. Now, they were creating stars. They would have the shoemaker who knew about opera, the Marine captain who knew about cooking, Joyce Brothers, a psychologist who knew about boxing. And these people, when they achieved $64,000 plateau and had won, became stars. And they were being exploited. People, they were writing books and they were being on other shows. And CBS was saying, wait a minute, we're creating these people. So they came up with the idea of $64,000 challenge. We bring them back and then they're challenged by people who say we can dethrone them. So that's the show we're talking about. It was a absolute surefire hit before it went on the air. Everybody knew. And so everybody wanted to host it, except Irwin here. He was not sure he wanted to host it. I was very happy doing $64,000. Let's Take a Trip, and having some degree of notoriety with that. But eventually I got suckered into doing a reading, and then finally I did an audio tape run through. Joe Cates was the producer director. And Joe called me in. He said, I want you to listen to the tape with me of your run through. Okay. So we sat there and listened to it. He said, what do you think? I said, I wouldn't hire me. He said, I agree with you. I don't think you're ready for it. I said, I think that's right. I mean, remember, I had only done 7 months in a girls' gymnasium of an educational show, and I had done a year now, not quite a year, of Let's Take a Trip, locations, no sponsors, out in nowhere land, very low pressure in that respect. And suddenly, I'm being now groomed for this biggest show of the year to go on. And he was right, I wasn't ready for it, and I knew that. So that was the end of that, I thought. And then it got closer and closer to when they were going to go on the air, and suddenly they were back to me, saying, we want to talk to you again. So I went back, and this time I did another run through, and it ended up with them coming down to just between me and one other person. So on a Friday night, I was to do a pilot. On a Sunday night, he was to do a pilot. And the next Sunday night, it was going on the air. I was doing my Let's Take a Trip. We were going to do 5 shows from out here. We were based in New York. We were doing five shows from California. I had a 5-month-old child then, and we were all going to go out for 5 weeks to California to do that. Suddenly, this thing came up. So I said, okay, Gloria, you and the baby go out there. Wait for me out there at the hotel. I'll be out. I'll take the red eye Friday night when I'm finished. So that Friday night, I did the pilot. And then I went out to dinner with Mr. Revson, who owned Revlon, and my agent and a few other people. And Revson turns to me at one point and says, well, of course, if you do it, you're going to have to change your name. I said, why? Now, remember, I'm on CBS every week as Sonny Fox. He said, well, nobody's going to believe that anybody named Sonny is going to give away that much money. And in my smart-ass way, I said, well, Mr. Revson, for what you're going to pay me, you can call me anything you want. And then I flew out to California, and I did my show that Sunday. Monday, the phone rings, and a voice says, Bill Fox, please. And I said, I'm sorry, you have the wrong room. He said, no, that's your name. You got the job. This is your agent. I said, Bill Fox? I thought they would ask me. So I flew back to New York with my wife and my baby. And on Wednesday, I showed up for the first time to say hello. And Sunday, I was going on the air. Meantime, the New York Times, Val Adams, had great fun because CBS had already released the fact that Sonny Irwin Fox was doing Let's Take a Trip. So the announcement on Wednesday in the New York Times was CBS Today announced that Bill, parentheses, Sonny, parentheses, Irwin Fox, has now been. Any rate, Sunday they said, here's your host, Bill Fox. And I got opening night telegrams from Paley and Stanton, and there was a house band, and there were 3 sponsors and 2 ad agencies and vice versa. And I suddenly was in this bloody pressure cooker, you know. And I realized that I was sort of pretending to be a host, that I was sort of trying to think how a host sounded. And yet nothing was coming from inside. It was all coming from outside. Stumbled my way through the first one. Got a call the next week from the production company saying, I have a problem about your name. I said, what? Well, there already is a Bill Fox on the after rolls. I said, all you high-powered people and ad agencies, nobody checked this out? He said, what's your real name? I said, Irwin. And there was a silence that went on for a beat too long. I said, I got a great idea. I said, why don't we just change my name every week, and people don't even want to watch the show. We'll turn in, what are they calling the schmuck this week? You know, it'll build up. So the second week of $64,000 challenge, the announcer intoned, and here's your host, Sonny Fox. Bill Fox totally disappeared. No explanation. I always had that feeling that out in Iowa on the porch, Mom was peeling beans and Dad's whittling, and she's saying, wonder what happened to that Bill Fox? He seemed like such a nice young gentleman, don't you think? Anyway, Bill Fox, you can make money on betting the name of the guy the first week. Anyway, I stumbled along.
Did you get notes about your
The notes were like this. Every time I would say, I don't think, no, we know, because these are the people who did $64,000 question. And Hal March was the prototype. He was extremely successful in what he was doing. But I was not Hal March, and they wouldn't let me find out who I was. I remember being called by the head of one of the big ad agencies to his office saying, I'm going to pile $64,000 up so you understand when you say $64,000 how you're supposed to say it. Then they would give me notes like, you picking that up out there? I still remember these things, you know. Okay. They would say, get rid of the losers. I would see these guys come out, or these women come out of the booth, the isolation booths, having lost, let's say, the $32,000 level. They'd come out. I'd say, I'm terribly sorry, but come on out. They come out in the pain in their eyes with this rictus of a smile, trying to look like they weren't going to cry as they were going to cry. And I just wanted to hug them and say, it's okay, life is going to go on. My instructions were, dump them, get rid of them fast. It was hard for me to do that. I didn't think that even at those rates that the fate of the world depended upon right answers and wrong answers. I just never bought into, I'm afraid, that whole theory about having to play this string out as though this was total reality, you know, which I should have, which if you're going to do it, you have to. Anyway, at Billy Pearson, a jockey, and Price, the actor, Vincent Price, were art collectors, and they were going at each other as art collectors. And the idea of a jockey being an art collector, you know, was what he came over and was challenged by Vincent Price, this wonderful dark figure from movies. And they were at the $64,000 level. It was a critical time, big audience. And I was reading the questions, and what happened is they would choose not to answer certain answers, go back. Well, let me skip that. I say, okay. So I was then reviewing with Billy, I think, what answers were left, and it was on both sides of the card. And I turned it over, and when I turned it over, my eye hit the answer instead of the question. I said, and I mentioned the name and kept going, and I realized what I had done. And they said, and I stood there not knowing what to do. And they didn't help me. You know, so then the shit hit the fan, as we would say. And there were editorials. I mean, I couldn't believe this country was caught up in this editorials about what to do. Anyway, they came back and they had to do it all over again. But that put my job really on the line. That was the fatal flaw. I mean, I had not shown any rate. You could see I didn't have confidence. You look at the difference between me on, say, my later shows, or even on Let's Take a Trip, and a clip of me on $64,000 Challenge, and you can see the sort of uncertain quality that I had on that show. I never took it over. I never owned that show. And so they fired me after 5 months. And I was sort of relieved, I must say. I still had my 64,000, my Let's Take a Trip show. But it was, it was like if a team is going bad, the manager gets fired. But if a team is in first place and the manager gets fired, it says something about the manager. I was fired from a show that was number 1 or 2 or 3 every week. So I couldn't say, well, I'm the scapegoat for a bad show. No, I was being told I was inadequate. So that was a thing I had to learn to cope with, because up till that point, my career had been doing just fine, just without me doing anything. It had gone way up.
How did your fans respond to your firing?
I don't know that I had a lot of fans. There was some interesting editorials and things in the papers, and I had some paranoia for a while that when I went out on the street, everybody was looking at me and pointing at me, But I turned out that life went on, and the sun came up in the morning. My family still loved me, and I still got money from CBS every week for the other show. So I was able to do okay. I did then do a lot of game shows for Goodson Todman as guest host. I did 64. I did Price is Right and Beat the Clock and I've Got a Secret and all those. I would do the fill-in for all those shows, and those were fun to do because they weren't my show, and I just had to do them for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Although there was still terror in doing live television. And for example, I was doing Let's Take a Trip at the Hudson Theater on 44th Street. Bill Cullen was the host. He was on vacation. Now, the one thing as a guest host you don't want to do, you don't want to screw up the show. You don't want to.
Let's Take a Trip? Is it so?
I'm sorry, Price is Right. I'm sorry. Price is Right from the Hudson Theater, Bill Cullen show. You don't want to screw up the show. You want to just keep it going and then give it back to the guy reasonably in the shape he left it in while he was on vacation. So here I am doing The Price is Right, and I say, okay, panel, if you look upstage at the curtain, you'll see June come through with the next item up for bids, and she's supposed to come through with a mink coat. Only what I saw was tapping on the curtain. She could not find the opening, and as she got more frantic, the tapping got wider and more pronounced, and the audience is starting to giggle. And somebody on the panel, a sailor on the panel, jumped up in a fit of trying to be helpful and threw the curtain open, revealing a stagehand who was about to do the same thing. Now he's looking like a deer on the oncoming headlights, paralyzed there. The audience is absolutely gone. I'm thinking to myself, this is not happening. I'm dreaming this because I've lost total control of a live show on NBC, so I finally caught my eye. I said, okay, June, go back behind the curtain. Shut the curtain. Everybody sit down. Now, oh, by the way, when she came through, she was hysterically laughing. And the tears of laughter, the rivulets of mascara were now streaming down her face. This is all part of that deal. So I had to get her back to everything. I said, and we stumbled through to the end of the show somehow. Those are some of the terrors of live television that you have to learn to cope with. And especially when it's not your show, it really is terrible to have to confront with that. But you learn to do that. That's one thing you do learn is you go through this era of live television. But again, the live television exacted a discipline which was really still with me. If you invite me for dinner at 7, you better be ready at 7 because that's going to be me at the door knocking. Because I back time. That's what you do when you're live. You know you're going to be on the air at noon, at 1, at 10. You know where you have to be at 5 hours before, 4 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours. You know if you're going to have a problem with that, and so you have to hit the mark. Later in later times when we were taping, I say, okay, let's get ready to tape at 8. Okay, 8 straight up. We're going to start ready to tape. 8:20, the lighting is still going on, and they're still fussing. I said, you guys would never have made it on live television. You never would have done that. And Let's Take a Trip also was, when you did live television, you had A and B plans. If you were on time, we were doing this Coast Guard show at the end of a tip of Staten Island. And by the way, the Coast Guard was thrilled because the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they were all getting movies made. They were all getting, the Coast Guard never got. So when we said we're going to do a Coast Guard show, every Coast Guard station in the country was on alert. Every admiral was at his television set. This was their moment of glory. Anyway, the end point was, if we were on time, I was to go up the gangplank of this Coast Guard cutter. We would sail off into the harbor. Credits going to roll. If we were short, I was to send the kids up, and I was to stay on the pier and close and pad. Toward the end of the show, we were running past a point to another location, Plan B, which meant we were running short. So the time came, I sent the kids up and on the Coast Guard cutter, and the captain was so excited being on television. He said, full speed ahead. They forgot to pull up the gangplank, and you saw the gangplank just go like that on television, and you just knew that every admiral was going onto his desk. There was a moment of glory. Anyway, they sailed off, so I stood at the end of this pier alone, nobody around me, nothing around me, skyline in the background, so I'm starting to pad. And when you pad, you don't start a whole new thought. You figure maybe you have to pad 30 seconds, so you let air into what you use, a few extra words, a few extra lines, but you're pretty much saying the same thing, only slower and more diffuse. Just at the time I'm running out of what I thought was the 30-second pad, they go like this. 3 minutes. 3 minutes. They screwed up in the timing. I'm stuck at the end of this pier alone, and I have 3 minutes to fill. That was not an opportunity. That was really a problem. I don't remember what I talked about, but after about 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes, I threw it back to them and said, okay, run a slow crawl. I'm out of stuff to say here. That was it. But those are the exigencies of live television that one had to learn to deal with. Anyway, $64,000 challenge sort of put a little crimp in my climb to the ultimate of stardom. But in a way, it was okay, because it would have meant a career of doing game shows. And as you recall from earlier in the interview, that was not my goal in life. I was not a big game show fan. So that took care of that. And then
shortly thereafter, it was really the quiz show scandals erupted.
2 years later, after I left, that broke. And you know what? I was as surprised as anyone. I knew. I mean, there were certain things that I knew about. For instance, the vice president of Chase Manhattan would come on with an envelope with the questions, because the questions for tonight had been in that safe at Chase Manhattan to ensure that nobody could have seen them ahead of time. And he came on with the envelope to bring me my questions for the show. Of course, they were the same questions I had just been reading in my dressing room, because I had to go over them to make sure I got pronunciations correct. And it was true. That particular set had been at Chase. The CBS never said it was the only set that existed. So there was that part to create an illusion. But the other thing was, anybody who came on pretending to be or claiming to be an expert got a huge interview. I mean, they examined these people for hours to really determine how expert they were. Now, let's say somebody, and this truly happened, came on and claimed that he was an expert in 17th and 18th century poetry. And indeed he was. But they gave him a category of English literature. Now, he would go through, let's say, to the $8,000 level, and somebody would say, you know what? He's not building. He's not attractive. I don't think he's connecting with the audience. Dump him. So at the $16,000 level, he showed up, and the question was about Beowulf. English literacy category, but far away from 16th. So you could play a way or two, where the strengths were, and you could then manipulate the outcomes to a certain extent that way. That's what I assumed was going on behind the scenes, because you figured they had to have some degree of trying to figure out where they were going. But when I found out that over a period of time they had gotten so arrogant that they were actually giving and rehearsing answers. Now, I knew Dan Enright many years later. The last show I ever performed was a show in '76 for CBS that Dan was producing. Dan Enright and Jack Barry were the original people who were outed when they were doing 21. Then the others, we found out the others, including $64,000 Challenge, had gone down the same pike. Jack and I would talk, and Jack would say, no, I didn't do anything wrong. It was just entertainment. I said, Jack, you committed a felony. You told people this was an honest skill, level kind of examination of expertise, and it wasn't. It was a rehearsed program. No, well, we finally agreed to disagree on that one, and we didn't discuss it. Late in his life, when they were doing the documentary that I was part of too about this whole thing, he was on it talking very openly about how they had fixed 21. And I called the lady he died soon after that, and I called the lady he had been living with. I said, why did Jack do it? Because I had asked him several times to do it, and he wouldn't. And she said, I think he thought maybe it was time, just that. But it was an example of greed and arrogance intertwined. And the networks got off scot-free on that one. I mean, Jack Barry and Danny Enright paid the price of being exiled for quite a while from television. But a lot of people were implicit in this and got off, or complicit in this, and got off scot-free, I thought.
Were you ever called to testify?
No. I had the extraordinary experience, though, of picking up the New York Times during the Senate hearings on a Sunday and finding a memo about me reprinted in the paper saying I wasn't registering as a personality, and the response was, let's put a flower in his lapel. I thought that was the level of thinking that was going on then, I guess. No, I was, as I say, I was just as surprised as anybody to read about what was going on. I knew the stories later that I got from, for instance, Patty Duke, when we had lunch many years later, was telling me that she was, she had been on $64,000 question as a spelling bee and had won. And later was called, when she was 15, she was called down to testify before Congress. Before she went down, Shirley Bernstein, Leonard Bernstein's sister, coached her on how to lie to the Senate. And then when she was about to leave the witness box, a avuncular senator turned to her in his avuncular tone and said, well, now, Patty, is everything you told us here today the truth? She said, no. They put her back on the stand and then got the truth. Now that kind of corruption, where you not only get the kid to be coached in the first instance, but then to teach her to lie to the Senate in the second instance, is an example of how when the pressures from the network, the money that's involved, and the arrogance that comes with the success can all intertwine and lead you down that particular path. We're seeing part of it now, I think, in terms of our financial world, too.
And you had just started talking about, you've done a lot of other game shows and things like that. But then at that point, though, where were you? You were still doing lots of
the last game show I was doing was a series out. It was a syndicated series called The Movie Game. It was out here, and it was... I did it for 6 months and really decided that I had to get back to producing. And I knew that people would not take me seriously as a producer if they kept seeing me as a performer. So I finally were coming up for an option, and I called my agent. I said, I want you to double my fee. He said, they'll never renew. I said, I hope so. And so I was forced not to be performing at that point. And I dug myself into a really good financial hole for 2 years. I picked up things. I was doing a series for the United Nations, a 15-minute series from the United Nations for about a year. That was distributed free to stations around there, just trying to get people to understand not the politics of the UN, but the institution of the UN. But that didn't pay very much, and I picked up other odd jobs along the way.
You interviewed some really interesting people during that.
Yeah, Madam Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Now that's just getting to know how to say the names. And Mrs. Roosevelt. Yeah, but but also, I was able to do some interesting features on there, and I be there every week and working with the UN television unit. But then I quit there too, and I finally ended up. My agent said, okay, Channel 5 in New York, this is 1959, I want you to do this 4-hour weekly show. And it was cartoons and stuff. And I was doing $64,000. I mean, I had been doing Let's Take a Trip, had gotten Peabodys and things like that, Doing I didn't want to do a local show with kids. But then I looked at my mortgage and my family up in Connecticut and said, well, Irwin, maybe this is what you're going to have to do. So I took a deep breath and I said, okay. And I thought I took a demotion, really, from network and all that stuff to doing this 4-hour epic in New York. Little did I know that it was going to lead me to maybe the best time I ever had on television, and a show that still resonates in people's minds. That's what's so strange about life, or so interesting about life, is, failure can lead to a whole new way of living. It's like being captured, not what I would advise people to do. Becoming a POW led to an extraordinarily different learning experience for me that changed my confidence in myself. I mean, people can threaten me if they want, but it takes a lot to scare me, having been through what I was been through. So I had learned through POW, and now through being discharged, fired from $64,000 challenge, a lot. And all of these things sometimes play out in such strange and interesting scenarios. People who think that they can write scenarios about life have a surprise coming to them, because life does major rewrites along the time. Life happens to you is really what happens. And if a door opens and you're bold enough to go through, that's the best thing you can do, because sometimes you'll fall on your face, but sometimes wonderful things will happen. I walked through that door that opened to Channel 5, and so it changed my life.
And talk about that show. What was the format when you joined?
Well, when I inherited they wanted to upgrade it. They felt that it was not a really very interesting show, nor a very successful one. The big thing was that the previous person was doing was they were having these tiny little turtles you could buy at the 5 and Time store, and they would have turtle races on the show, and kids would pick out which turtles were going to win. I mean, that was the highlight of the show. So it was the guy with Princess Ticklefeather. Anyway, so I wanted to upgrade it. I took it so seriously that I drove away the audience for the first few weeks. I became so ponderously educational that the kids who were watching the turtle races had no idea what I was saying, and the kids who would have maybe liked what I was doing didn't know I was doing it. I got called in by Bennett Korn, that station manager, after 3 weeks. He said, "We didn't hire you to lose an audience. So from now on, live for 3 minutes and then a cartoon." So I swallowed my pride yet again. And we had an audience, maybe 50 kids in the studio. And just to keep them from getting bored between takes, I started talking with them, doing some games with them. And finally one of the guys said, "Why don't you do that on the air?" I said, "Yeah?" I said, "Yeah." And so over a period of the next 6 months, I gradually understood what the show was about. And the show was about me and the kids, and about exploring those minds, and about getting to see where I could take them without a budget and with, And then the show began to be hugely successful. And after about a year, I had a large audience, and more importantly, I had their trust. I had their loyalty. And then the challenge for me always was, well, what do I do with this? Where do I take them? What kind of stuff can I bring into their lives or into my life that they would really profit by, that would intrigue them and me? And that was for the next 7 years. There was the 4 hours a day was really broke down. It was cartoons took up maybe an hour and some odd of that. Maybe commercials, certainly during the fourth quarter, took up an hour. So it was anywhere from 2 to 3 hours of time that I actually had to fill, and with no budget and the studio audience. So it began to grow as a show that was known for not talking down to kids, for treating them as individuals instead of just as background noise. And I found it was so wonderful to poke around their minds, like little George, who eventually you had to be 7 to get on the show, but earlier on he was 6. And George was part of the group of young boys who loved to talk about how they hated girls. They were girl-hating clubs. They had girl-hating clubs, I found. And George had just inveighed at great length about why he hated girls. And then I said, so you're not going to get married? He says, yeah, of course I'm going to get married. I said, George, you just told me how terrible girls were. Why would you get married? He says, well, my parents aren't going to live forever. Who's going to take care of me after I die? I thought to myself, that's why a lot of us get married, I think, probably. Yeah. So we have to have someone to take care of us. So, but think of that truth coming out of a 6-year-old's mouth, that insight. And then I started saying, okay, jokes. Tell me a joke up until the punchline, but don't tell me the punchline. If I know the punchline, you don't get a prize. If I know but if I don't know the punchline, you get a prize. So over a period of time, I got to know all the jokes, and it was harder to get a prize. So then they got smart. They said, it doesn't have to be a funny joke, so I can make up my own joke and my own punchline. So that started happening. And one day, one of my assistants came and said, well, there's a kid who today has a joke you're never going to get. And I said, why? Because he's telling it in Greek. I said, really? I said, is his parent here? Is his mother here? Yeah. So I went up to the place where we stashed the parents away. By the way, one of the things you'll learn if you want to really deal with kids and get to know them, take the parents away. When the parents left, it's as though we put them on the far side of the moon. Then it was just me and the kids. Parents didn't amount to anything. Well, now it's just us. Anyway, I went up and found this parent. I said, is the mother here whose child going to tell me a joke in Greek? I said, would you mind writing out the answer phonetically? Now, you know how quickly they sell their kids down the river? Like that. This kid had waited for so long to get on the show to tell me the joke, and she was giving away the kid's answer. So I got it. So when the time came for 4 kids to line up for jokes, she said the third one, Greek. I said, okay. So now I would sit down, the kids would stand up so that we were sort of at eye level. And so I put my arm around. I said, so you're the one who's got a joke I can't say? She says, yeah. I said, go ahead, let me hear it. And I said, that old one? And then I did the answer. And he went and turned away. I said, wait a minute, come back here. Aren't you amazed that I got that joke? He said, no, you know all of them, and left. And then there was the 8-year-old who was the quintessential 8-year-old. He had red hair, freckles, a gap in the teeth, and he lisped. Now, you can't get any more 8-year-old than that. And he said, how many feathers on a bird? I don't know how many feathers on a bird. How many stripes on a bee? I don't know how many stripes on a bee. What time was it when the fairy godmother told Cinderella to come home from the ball? I said, midnight. How come you know so much about the fairy, than nothing about the bird and the bees? On the floor. So that was one. And then I would do shows with just all the kids on the show were blind. 1 week, all the guests. And we talked about Braille, and we talked about their ambitions and their hopes, and we had just conversations. They told jokes. It was just like kids. You know, I wanted to sort of reduce the stigma. I wanted to sort of break through that. We had Joe Papp came on with his Shakespeare crew. We had Roberta Peters, you know, she played How Heroines Die. She brought all her costumes with her. And you would see me from the back, so I was singing in my part, you know, and she would sing her part. And then I would stab her, or she would die, and then she would go behind the screen, and we would stop, and then we'd come back in another costume uninterruptedly. And what I wanted to do is break down the image of what an opera soprano was, or what opera was, to have fun with a slim, beautiful woman, you know, and have fun with her. So we did that. But we also did Simon Says, and we also did musical chairs, and we also did, one of the great things I used to do was, now these are the desperate measures of a man who has no budget and 4 hours to spill. Kids in those days, boys, who still came with ties and jackets to the show. Of course, they never knew how to tie their own ties. And little girls came with white gloves and pocketbooks. And so I'd pick out 3 girls and 3 guys. And I'd say to the guys, put your hands behind your backs. Okay, you have 30 seconds to explain to her how to, and untie your tie. We had untie the ties, so they were dangling. You have 30 seconds to explain, not using your hands, how a tie is tied. And then you have 3 minutes to tie his tie. Well, you can imagine, first of all, trying to explain with your head how you tie a tie. And the little girl trying to get it all in and not understanding a word was being said. And then doing it, and say, no, not that way. And you'd go from one to, well, you could take 5, 6, 7 hysterical minutes. And at the end, you had them turn around and these strange things that were there. It was a never fail kind of thing. You couldn't do it today, primarily because boys don't wear ties. There's no such thing. But anyway, so how did we do all this? And then, now, I taught you about chutzpah and the Corvette. Let me tell you about chutzpah, the next definition of chutzpah. 1964, Senator Robert Kennedy, Senator-elect Robert Kennedy, this is a year after JFK is killed. He's just been elected senator from New York. This is the fall. I get a call, maybe October, maybe November, from his office. The senator wants to do in New York what he has been doing in Washington, which is at Christmas time, go to the disadvantaged neighborhoods, put on parties, give away toys. We'd like you to go with him. Chutzpah. My response was, here's the deal. Irwin from Brooklyn with his little local kids show. Here's the deal, Senator-elect Robert Kennedy. If he'll come on the show and talk to kids, I'll do it. Hour later, the phone rang, you got a deal. So that began something which happened every year for 4 years until his assassination. He would come on at Christmas time, talk to the kids. And then I went down to his estate and did a show for the embassy and consulate kids, and I got to know him. I'd go to Washington, I'd stop off. He'd pick me up in his car, and he'd drive me out to the airport, and he'd say, come have dinner. I said, no, I want to go back to my family. We weren't, I'm not an intimate of the senators, but I got to know him very well. And he loved talking with the kids. Now, I use the word with advisedly because few of us talk at kids. Most of us talk to kids. Very few people talk with kids. And he listened. He listened. He had conversation with them, not just speeches to them. And he was really a shy man, but he loved being with the kids. And so that worked out very well. So the joy of doing Wonderama was that I loved exploring the kids' minds, that their loyalty was so intense that I could take them anywhere. I once had the idea of doing elements of the theory of relativity, chutzpah number 3. I thought, well, that a yardstick becomes 18 inches at 90% of the speed of sound is fun to think about, that the heart is a clock as well as a muscle, that maybe elements of the theory of rest we could talk about. So the day came after months of preparation, in between commercials and Bugs Bunny, when I was going to explain. Well, I'm sure it was a disaster. I mean, my cameramen stood there with their jaws hung slack, their eyes glazed, dribble coming out of the side of my mouth. And I could hear little voices all over New York saying to their older brothers and sisters, Morris, what's he talking about? And then saying, that's okay, Bugs Bunny is coming up in 3 minutes. It's going to be all right. So I checked the ratings the next day, and I hadn't lost a point. They were so loyal, they even stayed through that. So that was the joy of doing Wonderama, and I did that for 8.5 years. And today, to this very day, I get emails from my kids who are now in their 50s. And some of them are really quite extraordinary. Like one came from a young man who said, I lived in a house where my father was cold and distant, and you were my father figure. I know you thought of it as a job, but to a lot of us it was a lot more. People saying, I just found your email, and they go on at great length about what it meant to them, what I meant to them in their lives. And that goes back to what I said earlier about Uncle Don. Maybe it's because kids don't have that much going on in their brains to begin with. I mean, there isn't that much information that fills their brain at that point, that we occupy so large a space in their heads that later on we have so much that's up there we can't have space, but there's no doubt that being remembered is flattering. The specificity and the intensity of their memories is startling to me always, because I have met 50-year-old men, women, who are very accomplished people, very successful people. They see me and revert to 10 years old, like that. Oh my God! I remember I was on your show, and and the joke. I said, I bet you remember the joke. Oh yeah, the joke was, and your spelling bee, and I missed the word. What was the word? They'll know the word, and there was that thing, and it just suddenly becomes very vivid to them immediately. The umbilical cord has never frayed, and that's both gratifying, obviously, but it's also a little frightening, because you think of all the people who are now doing things for kids, on television and other media, who are not aware enough of the impact that they're going to have in shaping those little you're leaving leaving a thumbprint on a malleable mind. That's an awesome responsibility that I would hope that people who deal with kids in the future will take seriously, because that's a wonderful and also awesome opportunity.
Did some of the advertising come into play?
Because
the advertising that you had on the show. Were you very cognizant of the advertising?
I was cognizant that we had a lot of sponsors, and I refused to wear hats, and I usually didn't want to drink the product, so I would bring kids in and then integrate them to do it great. And then I got a great idea. Filling time. I would have kids whose fathers owned vegetable stands or retail operations in the Bronx of some sort or other to come up and do a commercial for their father. And I would say, okay, where is the, okay, now, so do a commercial. I said, no, that's not selling. Is it the best merchant? Oh yeah. Is it the, yeah, well, really? So I would do those. I would have the kids do commercials for their fathers. Or I would have them come up and do the commercial with me, and then they would drink the stuff, So I tried to sort of, if I had to do a commercial live, to make it part of the entertainment, not just self-standing. But I had to do lead-ins, I had to do lead-outs, and the worst part was when I went on vacation. I would get 2 weeks vacation. I had to get somebody to fill in for me. That's another whole thing. But before I leave, I would have to do 80 commercial lead-ins and lead-outs, or live commercials, in one sitting. They would tape all those, because they wouldn't let the sponsors wanted me to do the commercial. Well, that gets very tiring. And I remember one day I was doing it, and late in the afternoon I hit a commercial for Jujubes. Remember Jujubes, the little candies? I don't know why that struck me as being funny, but I was so tired I started to laugh. And every time I tried to do that, I started to laugh. Then when I would sober up, the cameraman in the studio started to laugh. It was insane. We couldn't get past Jujubes. And I finally had to say, lock the cameras, get out of the studio, leave me alone. And I got through a Jujube commercial. But yeah, the fourth quarter, between September and into the holiday seasons, when we would have 40 to 42 commercials in the 4 hours.
And what about the kids? How did they get on the show? Was there...
If they knew my mother, basically. No, they would get on the show by writing in. I remember getting one telegram from a mother, please, before my child gets married, could we get him a ticket? So I sent her 2 kids. I said, send him a ticket for 2 tickets. So I respect, send 2 tickets in case these are kids already married. So they would send in and wait 5 years sometime. I mean, they would, at birth, they would send in an application. Business people, the market, the people who sold the commercials would get some of the seats and so on. So it was hard because there were only 75, and everybody in the metropolitan area of 18 million people, all the kids wanted to be on the show. So I would get in a cab, and a cab driver would say, my kid, So I would find names in my wallet after, I wouldn't even know who they were or what. I said, send them tickets. I didn't know whether was there or not. It was tough to get tickets to the show. It was the hottest, the New York Times did a piece about it and said it's the hottest ticket in town. Well, my sister in Middletown, New York, my younger sister had kids, and she found out it was the best deal because she would come in with her kids on a Thursday when we taped, park the kids at noon, or at 9 o'clock. Yeah, at 9 o'clock. No, at noon. Yeah, around when we started taping. Park the kids. She would go out, have lunch with her friends, do shopping, come back at 5, pick up her kids. They had been on a show, they had been fed, and they had won prizes. Big. That was a great deal for her. She got smart about that. My kids were not allowed to be on the show except once a year at their birthday time, around their birthday. I didn't want this to become their life. But it did play into my 9-year-old said, my oldest at that time said, how come you're home and you're on television? So I sat him down and I said, okay, good question. Now, that's a tape of what they did on Thursday. When you take a picture and there's a picture of you and there's you. You're not the picture, you're you. This is a picture of Dad that's on it. There's only one Daddy. And a couple of weeks later, he had a sleepover friend and they were watching the show, and then they broke to have some breakfast or something. And I heard his little friend say, how come your father's here and he's on television? And I said, what? And Chris said, I don't know, I got 2 fathers, one on television and one here. That's who just called. I said, the kid's going to be bedwetting when he's 21. And then little Dana was with me. He was 5. We were going to pick up Chris, 9, with his friends. So we got in the car to pick him up. And Chris came out of the house with his friend. But all his friends came out, and they all had paper for autographs. So I'm signing autographs until I get down to the last one, and it's little 5-year-old Dana. Can I have your autograph? This is my son. I said, you want my autograph? Yeah, okay. For whom? He said, for me. To Dana, your father is only 5. And he got it, and he turned to the other kids and said, I got it! Because suddenly it was currency, that was a value. He saw the other kids wanting it, suddenly it was important to him. But the problem with doing that show is I couldn't take my kids out to the zoo on a Saturday, or I couldn't go off with them. And if I was going into the theater with the kids seeing a show or something, I waited till the lights were just about before because then otherwise there were kids coming around, suddenly my kids were out on the outside and those kids were carrying it. So I had to deny myself that pleasure some of the times. But otherwise it was wonderful to do it.
Who else worked with you on Wonderama?
Beg pardon?
Who else worked with you on Wonderama? Did you have a staff of people that you depended on?
I had one person who served as the producer, though clearly I was. I had two and a half people. I had no money. They had no money. I got the money. I was being paid well, but there was no money for the show. And matter of fact, when I wanted a raise after I was successful on Wonderama, I went to Ben Corn and I said, well, look, I signed on cheap, but don't you think no, but if you do another show. So I invented another show called Just for Fun, which was 2.5 hours on Saturday, which was it was the camp. If anybody's ever been to camp, you know how they have the color wars. Half the camp is gold, half the camp is blue, and you have so blue team versus the gold team in stunts. That was a way to make more money. And after 5 years, when I was making enough money for Wonderama, I dumped that show. But that was my short show, 2.5 hours. And then at one point during that whole period of time, I was doing 2.5 hours Saturday, 4 hours Sunday. I was then, a client came, I said, I want you to do a network show for us. And I ended up with a show on ABC called On Your Mark, which I packaged and hosted. So now I'm doing 3 shows. And by the way, ABC, I had to go and get Channel 5 to let me do this one because it was on Saturday morning against their schedule. They said the only way we'll let ABC do it is if they black out Channel 7, the flagship station in New York, and give us the show. And you know what? ABC did that. ABC spent the money, bought the show from me, would not let their own station carry it in New York, but had Channel 5 carry it in New York. Now, the only way, the guy who was producing my Saturday show was trying to get to me about the show, the stunts for the show. He couldn't find me. He heard I was going to the dentist, hopped in the cab with me, knowing I would be sitting in one place while the guy was drilling, and went over the show with me that week while I was sitting there. It was a little insane at that time. That show only lasted 13 weeks, so that was okay.
You also did a show called Speak Out.
Oh, yes, Speak Out. That was only a year. I loved that show. That was a teenage bull session. This was in the 60s, and there was a lot of stuff going on in the 60s with the Vietnam War and the protests and young people and sex and condoms and free love and etc. So I had the idea of pulling in about 35 to 50 teenagers a week in a bleacher and just having a bull session about a topic. I would pick a topic. Interracial marriage might be a topic, was a topic. Occasionally have a guest with me, but very often not. And then the dynamics would start out with me and them, and then it would end up, hopefully, them to them. But it was just a free form place where teenagers could be heard and listened to each other. And I thought it was a darn good show. And finally, after a year, though, because it wasn't sponsored, 5 dropped it. But I thought it was, I loved doing that show. And I learned a lot. And since my kids weren't yet teenagers, it was a precursor of what I was going to be coming up toward. But yeah, it's funny you should mention this show. I forgot that one. That was a good show.
Now, were you doing Wonderama at that same time, or was that a little after?
Yeah, I was doing Wonderama. I was also doing Metropolitan Minutes. I mean, they had me doing a whole bunch of stuff there. And then they came to me and said, now we have a new show called The New Yorkers. We're going to be doing 2.5 hours every day. We want you to host it, but if you do that, you have to leave Wonderama. I said, why? Why can't I do both? They said, no, because we want you to be perceived as an adult personality. I said, well, let me do both for 13 weeks, because you may hate me, I may hate you, you know, and I have a budget, you know, still have a mortgage and a family. But they said no. So I had to make a decision back in 1967 about leaving Wonderama. That was a tough one. But I figured, okay, do I want to really end up being a 50-year-old host of a kids show? I wasn't 50, but that was the prospect if I had never left. And, you know, new challenges were attractive, and I couldn't think of another way to do Hanukkah or Christmas anyway on the show, so I figured, okay, maybe this is the time to leave and try a new way to go. And the talk variety show with music, Joe Raposo, who ended up being very big on Sesame Street, was my musical guy with a trio, and I had a co-host and an adult audience. And 2.5 hours and a very inadequate staff. And so it was tough. 2.5 hours every day was long, but I did it. And it never quite came together for me or for Channel 5, I think. But we did. I had Bob Hope on. I had Salvatore Dali was on with his animal. And then my host got pregnant, my co-host, so she had to leave the show. And for the last 3 months, I had different co-hosts every week. And that was fun. Colleen Dewhurst was my co-host for a week. And Colleen, the night before she was starting was the Tonys in New York, the awards for the theater. And Colleen was there. And I sat with Colleen, next to Colleen at the Rainbow Room was where the party was after the show. She said, "You like this gown?" I said, "Yeah, I like it. I love it." "GC hates it. That's why I wore it." GC Scott, George Scott. She was married to George Scott the second time around, married George Scott. They always had a tempestuous marriage. And he hated the gown. They had a big argument. So to flaunt him, she wore the gown. Now, that was the night before she appeared on the show. Now, she was on the show with me, and one of the deals was on Thursday, GC was going to come on the show as our guest. Wednesday, we're on the air live. Oh, by the way, GC is that point at the Vivian Beaumont doing a revival of The Little Foxes. While I'm off camera, she's on camera doing an interview. Flowers arrive for her, big bouquet of flowers, into the studio. The messenger comes and give them to me. So when she's finished, I go back on. I said, "These are for you." And I could see she immediately thought it was for me. I said, "No, they're not for me. I wish I'd thought about it. They're not." So she opens up. Now we're sitting side by side. She opens up the little thing. I'm leaning back to try to read it and says, "I love you, GC." It was an apologia from GC about whatever went on. And so nobody else knew what the card said or who the flowers were from. But she narrowed her eyes with those beady eyes of hers only she could. She said, "It won't help a bit," and threw the flowers away. We went on with the show. Later we get she comes in the next day and her eyes are swollen red. And I said, what happened? She said, "Well, word came back to GC at the theater." What did she say? Got the message what she said, which was his excuse for going on one of his patented toots. He was well known for this, going out and getting absolutely drunk, and didn't make the show that night at the Vivian Beaumont. She got the call up at South Salem where he lived, And she had to come down from South Salem and hunt all his old joints to find him and put him to bed in their bed. So she got very little sleep on Wednesday night. Thursday, of course, he didn't show up at our show either. Friday morning she came. Now she was wearing dark glasses. And what happened? She was up all night again. He went off again on another toot. I said, all right, keep the glasses on. I'll tell him you scratched your cornea or something like that. But that was life with Colleen as one of these things. But we had, Harris, the great actress, came on, and who was doing the poetry, the Emily Dickinson Theater. She was doing the Emily Dickinson play, the one-woman show. Help me! Harris, I did a movie with her, for heaven's sake. Anyway, she was wonderful. She did, and after the show was over, I said, I'd love to work with you. What is it you haven't done you want to do? Oh, I'd love to do Peter Pan, the play, really the play, not the musical. So that led to stuff. We ended up doing a movie together many years later because of that. So it was an interesting show, but it didn't quite work. So I left that show in 59. In 59.
69?
69. 67, 69, yeah.
Where did you go from there?
Oh, that's when I did that last game show. Then I went back to doing that last game show in 70. Then I decided to go back to producing. That's what it was. And then from 70 to 73, I did little of note except go into debt. You don't want the details of that. And 73, I had a conversation with Mort Werner, who was a senior VP at NBC, and I said, Mort, I really want to get back into producing. If you have anything that comes along, let me know. He said, well, actually, come see me. He said, there's a new show going on out in California called The Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder. You want to go out there and help get that on the air? He said, the money is short, but he said, and if I were you, I wouldn't do it, but if you want it, it's yours. So I had a conversation with my wife, because I was going to have to leave her behind with the kids. I said, I'll try it. If it's good, if it works, if there's money, I'll move you out. If it's not, I'll come home. So I wrote a contract with NBC that allowed me to fire them every 13 weeks. And out I went to my new adventure with The Tomorrow Show and Tom Snyder. Tom was an extraordinary man. First of all, we were opening up 1 to 2 in the morning, which had never been done before. The rules with NBC and with the show before us was that Johnny Carson, was that we couldn't use any of the talent Johnny Carson used. And we couldn't use any of the talent Johnny Carson had ever used. And we couldn't use any of the talent that Johnny Carson might use someday. And there's a guy named Dave Tebbutt at NBC who was a VP who was in charge of making sure of all the above. And I had many meetings with David to try to get something. The good news about that is it forced us to do things that nobody else was doing. And so we were able to define the Tomorrow Show with some bizarre elements, some interesting elements. As I kept telling people, I said, I think the mind of our audience shuts down after the 11 o'clock news. And when at 1 o'clock, if they're watching, they're alone. And if they're vulnerable, it's when the goblins come out, when they deal with their fears and insecurities. I said, that to me is an interesting audience and an interesting fix. Let's think about how we talk to that audience. So I don't want to see authors of books. I don't want to see politicians. I don't want to see those people. I really want to talk about maybe bizarre, well, they wanted to talk about bizarre sex, which was, they talked about a lot. But I wanted to talk about death. I wanted to talk about things like that. That intrigued me. I came back once from being in New York, and I saw on the board that they had death on the board as one of the top. I said, good, who you got? Well, we have this professor of thanatology. I said, no, if you're going to do death, you get somebody who's dying. Well, how do you do that? I said, give me 24 hours. I called up the cancer people, and I said, this is what we want to do. And we really want to talk about how do you deal with these terminal phases of your life. And we want to deal with it personally, and we want to deal with it with an immediacy. They said, well, they said, we have somebody who's dying of, and I can't remember what he was dying of. But I said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I don't want to call the guy, because I never want to feel I have lured him into doing something he's uncomfortable with. If he calls me, then I know he wants to do it. So that's the way we're going to do it.
Okay, let's stop there to change.